The final lecture on cryptography is about key management. As I've already mentioned, key management is actually critical for the security of any form of cryptography. And it's a very hard problem. We need to find some way to communicate keys, ideally over an insecure network, in a way where we can still be certain that the key corresponds to the correct person. Without that, the system doesn't work. So, why is key management hard? So far, we essentially assumed that Alice knows Bob's public key, or that somehow the two share a key of some kind. Now, what if Alice talks to hundreds of Bobs every day? This is exactly what happens in your browser. Whenever you go to an HTTPS protected website, then the browser will have to ask for the certificate, and the certificate will indicate what the public key of the server is. Right? So we're exchanging keys all the time. We're talking to other servers all the time. Now, we cannot trust Bob to tell Alice his public key online. It could be Mallory impersonating Bob. And at this point, we have no shared key yet. If we go to a particular website, say google.com, we don't know in advance what the key of the website is. So there's no way for the website to tell us in a way that we can trust what its key is. Now, we have essentially two options. The first is to get the public key through a separate trusted channel, and the second is to get a separate trusted third party to authenticate the keys. Now, the first one is definitely not viable in these scenarios. So the trusted channel would have to be something that bypasses the internet, or at least goes on top of the internet but with some kind of protection. But at that point, we no longer need to establish the key. So ideally, the trusted channel means contacting someone in person, asking to see their ID, and then verifying the key with them. This is of course not practical, so in practice we always use a trusted third party to authenticate keys. Now, there are also some peer-to-peer schemes which I will not discuss in this lecture, but they again depend on trusting a number of parties, even if it might in that case not be a single trusted party. First, I will discuss the so-called key distribution center. And the key distribution center is a way to distribute symmetric keys. Now, we have a single trusted party, which I'll refer to as T here for trusted, and T shares the symmetric keys with all the others. So every party able to communicate has a single private key that is shared with the trusted party T, and they can communicate directly with the trusted party, but not necessarily with each other. Right? So Alice and the trusted third party share a key. Bob and the trusted third party share a key. Even Eve and Mallory might have keys that they share with the key distribution center, but none of these parties have keys they share amongst each other, because there are simply too many parties to all share the keys. Right? So if we have n parties, then the number of keys needed in this scheme scales with n, whereas if every pair of parties would share a key, it would go with n squared, which is of course impossible. Right? That doesn't scale. So the trusted third party shares a key with each of the users and also verified the identity of the key owners. So an example could be that they actually came to the trusted third party in person, showed their ID, and then provided the key. In practice, of course, there are other ways which are a bit more lightweight, although they might not be equally secure, but somehow the trusted third party has verified that these keys belong to these people. Now, if Alice ever wants to talk to Bob, they don't necessarily share a key. So Alice will need to get a key first from the key distribution center that allows her to talk to Bob. I'll need some notation to explain how key distribution centers work. So the capital letter K will refer to a key, and the subscripts indicates the parties that the key is shared between. So KAT will be a key shared between Alice and the trusted third party, which is the key distribution center. KBT refers to a key shared between Bob and the key distribution center. Now we don't have keys shared between parties, such as Alice and Bob, but we will generate in this scheme temporary keys for this purpose. And the temporary key in this case will be called KAB because it will be shared between Alice and Bob. Now, additionally, we will encrypt messages using the encryption function E, which takes a particular key as a parameter, and then we can encrypt a particular message specified by N here. And then we have a capital letter N, which refers to a random number that is never reused. Now this is known as a nonce, which stands for number once. Okay, this is necessary for the protocol to work. So the communication will be encrypted using the key KAB, but this key will be generated using an interaction with the key distribution center. So the key distribution center is going to help us establish a key to encrypt the communication between Alice and Bob. The interaction starts as follows. Alice will ask the trusted third party that runs the key distribution center whether she can talk to Bob. Now, the message in this case specifies her identity and Bob's identity, A and B in this case. Right, so this is a message sent by Alice and received by the key distribution center. Now the key distribution center helps Alice by setting up a key. Now this key is the temporary key KAB, but it's sent in an encrypted form. We're encrypting this key using the encryption function for the key shared between Alice and the trusted third party. Right, so we get the encrypted key. Now this part should be more or less obvious. But we're also sending another value, which is encrypted using Bob's key. So Alice will not be able to read it. And this is this part. And so this part is an encrypted version of both the identity of the person to talk to, namely Alice, and the key KAB, which is the temporary key that Bob will also need to know. Okay, so including Alice in the identity of Alice in here is critical because it helps Bob establish that the key distribution center actually generated this key for Alice and Bob specifically. Now, Alice starts talking to Bob, and Alice provides the encrypted key that the key distribution sent to her. Now, Bob is able to decrypt this message using the key that he shares with the key distribution center. And because only the key distribution center knows this key, only this center would be able to generate the correct message. So being able to decrypt this authenticates the contents of the message, which is the identity of Alice and also the temporary key. Right, so Alice was able to obtain this value because she decrypted the message she got from the trusted third party, even if she cannot decrypt this part intended for Bob. Now, the next message is to verify that Alice actually has the key. So we've established that the key distribution center knows this is Alice, because only Alice would be able to decrypt the message encrypted with the key KAT. But Bob doesn't actually know whether Alice is the same Alice that the KDC verified. So Bob wants to verify that Alice actually knows the key that he indirectly got from the key distribution center, encrypted with his own key. Now what does Bob do? Bob generates a nonce, N, so a large random number. And this number is then encrypted using the shared key that was generated by the key distribution center and that both Alice and Bob now have. Now Alice sends back the same nonce, but with the number 1 subtracted from it and again encrypted. Now Alice can only produce this number if she is actually able to decrypt the nonce, then perform the operation, which is obvious of course, and then encrypt it again. This can only be done if Alice actually knows the key. So at this point, Bob knows that the trusted third party was the one who generated the key, that the trusted third party generated this key for communication with Alice, and that the person Bob is actually talking to is Alice. At this point, it's clear that the key is secure, and we can simply send messages between the two using this key. The protocol I just described isn't actually a really existing protocol because it's insecure. And the reason is that we can have replay attacks in the protocol as I described it. So it's possible to take an old message and replay it again. Now this is something that we need to prevent. And in fact, what I presented here was a simplified version of the Needham-Schroeder protocol, which actually includes all the nonces and timeouts, at least in its latest versions, to be able to do this securely. Now this is an important protocol because the Kerberos protocol is based on it. And Kerberos is a system that is very widely used in computer systems that need to authenticate users and establish keys. In particular, it's used both in Windows and in many Unix-like operating systems. So the Kerberos system, based on a more complex version of the protocol I just described, is actually very widely used for key distribution when we're talking about symmetric keys. As I mentioned, Kerberos is very widely used, but it doesn't mean it's entirely without flaws. So Kerberos has a number of important flaws. First of all, you need constant access to the key distribution center. So every time you're going to communicate with someone, you first need to talk to the KDC to be able to get a temporary key that you can communicate with. This is a major drawback, of course. Also, the trusted third party is a single point of failure. So if we're worried that the trusted third party might not always be available, one thing we can do is replicate it. However, what we cannot really fix is that whenever the KDC is compromised, all the shared keys can also be compromised. Now this would be a complete disaster because it would mean having to set up all these keys again, throwing away all the old keys and establishing new ones, checking the identities of the people involved and so on. Right? So this is a very expensive operation that we really do not want to do. So even with replication, it's still a single point of failure in terms of security. Moreover, as I mentioned, there is a risk of replay attacks. They can be fixed, and they are in fact fixed, but this requires some very strict timeouts. Now this means that there's a very strict requirement on the clocks to be in sync. In the past, you would actually often see this. If a computer timer was running out of sync, it would not be able to authenticate with remote servers. For example, early Windows versions, this is something you would commonly see. Now, modern systems typically synchronize the clock with a central time, which mostly fixes this problem. But even then, we have the issue that we need to get new keys frequently, because the keys expire quickly to prevent replay attacks. Now, despite all these drawbacks, Kerberos and similar systems are very useful and very widely used, but they're not the only system around. And in fact, if we're going to go to websites, as I mentioned before, then we need another type of system. We need something that's more suitable for asymmetric cryptography. To mitigate the drawbacks of the key distribution center that we saw before, what we can do is we switch from symmetric crypto, which was used in the KDC approach, to asymmetric crypto. Now this allows much more freedom because now we don't have to have shared keys, but rather each party can have their own private key and share the public key, which we will see can also be valuable in key distribution. Now the approach is broadly this. We again have a trusted third party, but now the trusted third party is not directly involved in every interaction, but instead it issues a so-called certificate to verify Bob's identity. So the certificate shows that Bob has been identified by the trusted third party and what Bob's public key is. Now, of course, we need to verify that the certificate is genuine, but the certificate will include a signature from the trusted third party to make this work, to show that it's actually verified by them. Now, this is based on certification authorities. So the trusted third party I mentioned in this case is a certification authority. And this is typically a company. And what the company does is it issues certificates and it keeps track of a so-called revocation list of certificates that might be compromised. So when this certificate is issued, the company will first verify the identity of the person or organization that it issues a certificate to, and then it takes the public key from this person, embeds it into the certificate, and signs the certificate as proof that they actually verified it. Now, what is interesting here is that we actually need to trust these companies. And operating systems actually have embedded lists of trusted CAs. Now, this is a very, very long list, which you can actually see if you check your own browser. A very long list of companies which you've never heard about, that for whatever reason, Microsoft or whoever manages your Linux distribution thought could be trusted. Now, what is interesting, even if you have a single compromised certification authority, you can generate forged certificates and pretend someone is someone else. So, as you can see, this is a little bit of a weak link here. Now, this system, although it has a weak link, is very widely used, and it's known under the name public key infrastructure. So it's essentially an infrastructure set up by the certification authorities to distribute public keys and associate them with the identities of their owners. I mentioned certificates before without explaining what they are. Now, the certificates I was talking about are actually known as X5.09 certificates, which is a standard that specifies how these certificates can be stored. Now, these certificates are basically small files, and this file includes all the information that is necessary to authenticate the owner and to authenticate the certificate itself as well. Now, these files contain, among others, the identity of the holder. So if we're sending a message to Bob, it will include all the identifying information for Bob. If we're talking to a website, it will actually contain the domain name of the website. The domain name of the holder, of course, is also included. This might be the same as the identity of the holder, or there might be additional information specified as the identity and the domain name kept separate. Then the public key of the holder. This is essentially what it's all about. So the system is set up to distribute public keys, and the public key of the holder must be known to send messages to the holder where we know that no one else can read them. Right? So if we use the public key of the holder, then we need the private key of the holder to be able to decrypt these messages. And only the holder of the certificate has this corresponding key. Now, there's also an expiration date, which is very important because keys might leak at some point, CAs might get compromised, old crypto methods might no longer be appropriate. So we cannot keep certificates around forever. We have to replace them at some point with a newer certificate. And finally, this is also of critical importance, a signature from the certification authority. So the certification authority places a digital signature, which could be, for example, an RSA signature, to show that they were the ones who created the signature. If the CA generated the certificate, it means that the CA verified the identity of the holder and verified that it was linked to this public key. Now, here we can see what such a certificate might look like. Of course, in reality, it's just a file, but this shows some of the main content. Right, so we see here the common name, as I mentioned, for a website. The name will simply specify the domain name. There might be additional name information, such as the organization. Right, so this depends. Then there's a bunch of other stuff, but there's also the identity of the issuer, which is the certification authority. So this particular certificate for ING Bank was issued by Entrust, which is one of the major certification authorities. Now, it has a period of validity which specifies from and to which date it is valid, and then there's some additional information such as hashes that identify the certificate. Right, so this is the information that is stored, and it's stored in a well-known binary format typically. There are also actually ASCII encodings of this format though. Now, how do we obtain such a certificate? Well, the first step is that Bob generates a public-private key pair. It's important that Bob is the one to do this and not the certification authority, because this is required for non-repudiation. We have to make sure that we know that Bob is the only one who has the private key. Now, Bob generates a so-called certificate signing request, which is actually very similar to the certificate itself. It contains all the data, but it lacks the signature that approves the certificate as being validated by the certification authority. It does, however, include, and this is very important, the public key, as well as information on Bob's identity. Now, the CA will verify Bob's identity, so perhaps Bob will go to their office and provide an identity document. He might provide some information about the company if this certificate is issued to a company, and show that he's actually allowed to represent the company. Or in some other cases, there might be a more lightweight process, and Bob might simply email a scan of his identity documents, or perhaps even fax them. Right? In these contexts, those old systems are still sometimes used. Then, if the CA is actually satisfied of Bob's identity, the CA creates a certificate, which is actually just a CSR, but including a signature. Now, the CA uses its own private key to sign the certificate. Bob can now use this certificate to prove that the public key is actually his. The scenario I just described involves a CA, a certification authority. This is not the only way we can make this work. It's also possible to generate a so-called self-signed certificate. And this means that we create a certificate, but we sign it with the same private key that corresponds to the public key. Now, anyone can easily make a self-signed certificate. This saves some money. But it's important to note that such a certificate is not trusted by default. And it shouldn't be, of course. If we get a self-signed certificate, we have no way to determine whether someone actually verified your identity, as the CA would have done in the other case. So these are not trusted by default, but they're still sometimes useful because they allow you to simply configure your program to trust this particular certificate. Now, if you're able to verify the public key in person, you could securely use a self-signed certificate for this purpose. And you can just install it into your browser, and your browser will remember that this particular certificate is also valid. Now let's say that we receive a certificate, for example when visiting a website using HTTPS, and we want to verify whether this certificate is actually valid. Now there's quite a few steps we actually need to go through to verify all the important properties of the certificate. So first of all, the server address must match the certificate. Right? So we saw, for example, the certificate for ING Bank has the address www.ing.nl in there. And of course, if we're using this certificate to visit another website, then the certificate is not okay, because it identifies another party than the one we want to be talking to. Now, the server must also demonstrate that they have knowledge of the private key matching the public key specified in the certificate. Right? Otherwise, if there's no such thing, we still do not know for sure the server's identity. So this could mean that you decrypt some data that was encrypted using the public key in the certificate, or that you create a signature, which is valid when checked with the public key. The certificate should, of course, not be expired. The signature from the CA must actually be valid, so we need to check the CA's signature, and this also means that we need to know the CA's public key. Now, the public key will be embedded, but we need to know for sure that we trust this public key. Now, for this purpose, we need to have a list of trusted CAs, which, as I mentioned, will be embedded in your operating system typically. So, for example, if you run Windows, Microsoft maintains a list for you that will be updated through Windows updates, for example, and this list specifies all the CAs that are trusted. It has their public keys. So using these public keys, we can verify whether the certificate was signed by a trusted CA. And if you want, you can manually add more CAs to this list. Also, the certificate must not be on the revocation list. So CAs should keep track of a revocation list, which includes any certificates that have been compromised. Now, the certificate would be compromised if the private key became known to someone else than the owner of the certificate. And in this case, of course, we want to make sure that the certificate can no longer be used, which is why we have these revocation lists. At this point, we've discussed both key distribution centers for symmetric keys and public key infrastructure for asymmetric keys. Now, there's another operation which is very important, especially in today's internet, and this is symmetric encryption key establishment. So this is a situation where we have two parties talking who want to agree on a shared key. Okay? And the important thing is here, they're talking over an untrusted network. They're sending all the data necessary to be able to agree on a key. Yet it must be impossible for anyone listening in on the conversation to also figure out what the key is. Now, personally, I actually found it pretty cool that this is possible. But it turns out you can do this. You can find a shared key over the network without sending any information from which a third party can derive the key. And a very well-known algorithm for this is known as the Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange. Now, it's actually a surprisingly simple approach. If you know some modular arithmetic, I will leave out all the details, all the math behind this. You can, of course, if you go into a more advanced course, or if you simply look it up, you can find this easily, and the math is not actually that bad at all. Like RSA, Diffie-Hellman is based on an assumption, and this assumption is that a particular mathematical problem is very hard to solve. In this case, the problem is not prime factoring, but rather the discrete logarithm problem. And it means that it's very hard to undo exponentiation modulo an integer. So to compute something equivalent to the logarithm, but then in a mathematical construct using a modulus, right? Rather than floating point numbers. Now, how does the Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange work? As I mentioned, it's pretty simple. And we start off with Alice and Bob agreeing on the modulus M and the base G. Now, these numbers need not be hidden. So if Eve or Mallory finds out, it's not an issue. The next step is that Alice and Bob both generate a secret exponent. So the one that Alice generates we'll call A, and the one that Bob generates we'll call B. Now think back again about the pseudo-random number generators. This is clearly one of those cases where you want to make sure that you have a completely unpredictable random number. Okay? Now the next step is that Alice and Bob send each other some information. So Alice sends the base to the power A modulo M, whereas Bob sends the base to the power B modulo M. Now remember the discrete logarithm problem I mentioned. It's not possible to derive A from the number that Alice sends, or to derive B from the number that Bob sends. So they send each other this data, and this data by itself does not allow you to derive the original values. Now what do? Well, they simply take the number that they receive and exponentiate it again. So Alice takes the number she got from Bob and takes it to the power A, whereas Bob has the number that he receives from Alice and takes it to the power b. It turns out, if you do it like this, then you get simply the exponent being the multiple of a and b. Right? So you multiply a and b and take g to this power. That is the number you get here. So both parties get the same number, even though someone who has both the numbers that were sent cannot derive this number. So both now have the key, which is g to the power a times b, which cannot be derived from the numbers that were sent. So this, I think, is actually a pretty cool approach, and it means that Alice and Bob have been able to agree on a key that both of them know, but none of the people in between know. Of course, keep in mind that one critical part is still missing here, namely authentication. We know that we agreed on a key with whoever we were talking to, but at no point do we actually determine who this person is. So the Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange by itself cannot establish a key with someone who we know, because we don't know if the person we're talking to is that person. And the same protocol could easily be done in this case between Alice and Mallory. And Alice would have no idea that whenever she uses this key, Mallory can use it. And this opens the situation up to a man-in-the-middle attack. Now, this is why, in addition to Diffie-Hellman, you still need something like the public key infrastructure to ensure you know the identities of the parties involved. Now, I've mentioned the web several times in the context of a place where you need encryption, key establishment, and so on. So why is this an issue? Well, the issue is that anyone who's eavesdropping on someone using the web can read HTTP. So the HTTP protocol in itself is completely unsecure, and anyone in between, such as internet service providers, network administrators, but also government agencies and hackers who hack the protocols that are involved, are able to read your traffic. So if you want to have any idea of privacy, but also integrity, being able to know who you talk to, you need encryption on top of this. And there are many scenarios where this is critical. Think, for example, of forms that specify passwords, online banking, credit card payments, and so on, but also whistleblowers who might need protection from the government. All these people, all these situations require some form of encryption to be viable, because it's so easy to intercept and read normal HTTP traffic. So encryption of this traffic is critical. We achieve this encryption using the so-called secure sockets layer, also known as transport layer security. So the terms are officially refer to different versions. In practice, they're used more or less interchangeably. And this is a system that provides a layer on top of the TCP protocol. So HTTP, of course, builds on TCP. Now, this provides a layer on top of TCP, which essentially comes between TCP and HTTP. Now, where TCP provides a connection-oriented socket, SSL creates a secure connection-oriented socket. So anything that's written into the secure socket is actually encrypted, and of course using various protections that are also necessary, such as key establishment, and then it's sent in an encrypted form over TCP. Now, any TCP protocol can in principle be modified to run on top of SSL, and in case we do this with HTTP, it's known as HTTP Secure or HTTPS, which at this point should be almost all the websites you visit. So these run over TCP using SSL to encrypt the HTTP traffic that you send and that you receive. Now, SSL achieves various goals, and the interesting thing is that it essentially brings together almost all the protocols that we discussed so far. We need end-to-end encryption to make sure that only the browser and the server can read the communication. So the browser communicates with the server, but no one in between is able to read their communications. Now, Diffie-Hellman is used to establish a shared encryption key and achieves this goal. Now this allows us to assure confidentiality. We know that no one else can read the communication because no one else can derive the Diffie-Hellman key. Additionally, SSL typically authenticates the server using an X5.09 certificate, which is necessary to prevent a man-in-the-middle attack. If someone were to pretend to be the server, then this could allow a man-in-the-middle attack where this person establishes a Diffie-Hellman key with you and also one with the server and forwards the traffic while being able to decrypt it. Right, so that is something we also do not want, and that SSL prevents. Finally, SSL can also authenticate the client, so proving to the server who the client actually is, but this is not necessarily the case, and it's actually rarely used in practice because the server is also able to identify the client in the application layer once that the secure communications have been achieved. So this step is not really necessary in practice, although it is sometimes used in particular contexts. In a lecture on key management, passwords cannot really miss, because passwords are also effectively used as keys. They are used to authenticate a user, and they can even be used to generate a crypto key. Moreover, they are often reused between systems. Right? So if you have the same password on multiple websites, it means that this password is a high value target. You can then hack one website, figure out the password, and reuse it elsewhere. Now, you need to be very careful with this. And in fact, the SQL injection vulnerability that we discussed before in the lecture on web security often would allow you to reveal all the stored passwords. Now, this would seem like a bad design, but it's actually very common. So you can actually look up on the website, have I been owned, whether your information has been leaked somewhere. And it's very unlikely, if you've been using your email address for a while, that your data has not been leaked at some point. Now, what do we want to do? We want to make sure that we don't store the passwords themselves, because if you do this, it means that they can be leaked. And we still need to be able to verify whether a password is correct, because otherwise we cannot authenticate a user with the password. How can we achieve this? Well, the answer we already know. It is to hash the password, as we've seen in assignment 1. But we need to be careful there. Now, hashing the password is useful because of the properties of the hash function. In particular, we cannot recover the password from the hash. This is pre-image resistance. And if we have two identical hashes, we can assume that the password is correct. This is second pre-image resistance, because it means that the hacker is not able to generate another password that matches the hash. Now, one issue that you get is brute forcing. Many passwords are actually very easy to guess. Again, we've already seen this in assignment 1. And then the attacker can make a so-called rainbow table, which contains the hashes of many passwords. Now, matching leaked hashes against a rainbow table is a very efficient way to figure out the passwords for many users. So this way, essentially, you get for very little compute power all the users who use common passwords, and many users do in practice. What can you do to solve this? Well, the first part that is critical is to use a so-called salted hash. Again, we've seen this. What you do when storing the password, you generate a random string, you concatenate this salt with the hash before hashing, and then you store the salt together with the hash. Now, this makes rainbow tables unfeasible, but it's not in itself enough, because if you can efficiently compute hashes, you can still perform the attack. So part 2 of the solution is to use a slow hash. Now, a typical hash function is designed to be very fast, but that's not actually what we want here. If the hash is very fast, it means that an attacker can go through the table very quickly and verify the hashes to see whether any common passwords have been used. What you can do is, for example, perform the same hash 1,000 times over. Now, if we do this For the typical purposes on a modern machine, it should still be fast enough to verify the password. But if you do brute forcing, it actually slows down the efforts by a factor 1000. Right? So we see an impact here which is very asymmetrical. For the regular purpose, the impact is barely anything at all, but for being able to brute force the password, it makes it much, much harder. So this is definitely something we want to do for password storage. Now, passwords were the last topic in key management, which was itself the last topic in cryptography. So this ends the lecture on cryptography.